The auctioneer's gavel never fell. There was no stage, no crowd, no public shame. There was only a Sunday morning kitchen, a father clearing his throat, and a stranger sitting in the good chair holding his hat like a prayer he'd forgotten the words to. Clara Whitmore was 19 years old the morning she learned she'd been sold not at market, but across a breakfast table quietly the way men dispose of things they no longer find useful. The price was $80, less than a good horse, less than a month's wages for a skilled man, less than anything she'd ever believed herself to be worth. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. And if you believe that broken beginnings can lead to something beautiful, hit that like button and stay with us until the very end. She was sold for $80 to pay her father's debt, less than the price of a good horse. Wyoming Territory. September 1882, the morning Clara Whitmore learned she'd been sold, she was washing a plate that was already clean. She knew it was clean. She'd washed it twice. But her hands needed something to do while her father's chair creaked in the front room, while his newspaper rustled with the sound of a man pretending to read, while the particular silence of her mother moved through the kitchen like smoke present, shapeless, impossible to hold. The water in the basin had gone cold. September light cut through the single window above the sink, sharp and indifferent, illuminating the dust that hung suspended in the air of their kitchen. The way her future hung suspended in her chest, weightless, directionless, already drifting towards some end she couldn't see but had felt coming since she woke before dawn to the sound of her father's boots on the floor above her head. He only paced before dawn when the news was worst. Clara. His voice carried the false brightness he reserved for selling things, the tone he'd used when he sold her mother's wedding ring, when he traded their good mare for a lame one and 2 bottles of whiskey, when he mortgaged this house to a man whose smile showed too many teeth. She dried her hands slowly, buying seconds that would not save her. Then she walked into the front room. The man sitting in the good chair, the one reserved for company they almost never had, was someone she'd seen but never met. Ethan Cole. The town knew him the way it knew the creek that ran dry in summer, present, unremarkable, frequently disappointing. He was perhaps 30, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate little, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water after rain. He wore clean clothes that had been mended more than once. He was not looking at her. That was the first thing she noticed. Every other man she had stood before had assessed her, immediately claimed with their eyes what their hands hadn't yet touched. But Ethan Cole kept his gaze fixed on the wall behind her left shoulder, where her mother's embroidered sampler hung with its faded blessing, "God bless this home." His large hands turned his hat in a slow, steady rotation like a prayer wheel that had forgotten its purpose. "Clara, this is Mr. Cole, I say." Her father's voice had settled into heartiness, now the register of comfortable lies. "He's made us a very generous offer." The plate she'd been holding might as well have shattered on the floor. She'd known since she woke. She'd known from the pacing, from the whiskey smell her father hadn't quite scrubbed away, from the particular way her mother had kneaded bread dough that morning. Head down, shoulders curved inward, hands working with the mechanical determination of a woman who had already spent all her grief and had nothing left but motion. "He's agreed to settle our accounts with Mr. Thornton." Samuel Thornton. The name landed in the room like something thrown. The debt collector, whose visits had grown more frequent, whose eyes cataloged their furniture the way a man calculates salvage value. He'd given them 30 days to produce $300, a sum her father couldn't earn in a year. Not with his gambling habit, bleeding every dollar dry before it could take root. In exchange, her father continued, and she heard the slight tremor. He tried to smooth away. "Mr. Cole has asked for your hand in marriage." The words dropped into the silence of the room and kept falling. "Today," Clara heard her mother's sharp intake of breath from the kitchen doorway. Heard her father's forced smile cracking at the edges. Ethan Cole's knuckles had gone white around the brim of his hat. No, the word came out smaller than she'd intended, barely more than breath. Her father's smile vanished. "Clara, I said no." Louder this time, though her voice shook. "You can't. I'm not." But the words tangled on her tongue because she was 19 and unmarried and lived under her father's roof, which meant she had exactly as much say in this as the furniture he'd already mentally parceled out to cover his debts. You'll do as you're told. His voice had hardened into the register. She knew the one that preceded his belt, his backhand, his cold fury at a world that refused to accommodate him. Mr. Cole is offering you a home, a name, a future that's more than you'd have otherwise. Otherwise meant Thornton, meant the workhouse in Laramie, meant whatever happened to young women whose fathers couldn't pay and whose bodies became currency in transactions they'd never agreed to. Clara looked at Ethan Cole then. Really looked. He was still studying her mother's sampler, jaw tight, a muscle working beneath the stubble he'd missed shaving. His hands, large scarred across the knuckles dirt, worked so deep into the creases that no amount of scrubbing would lift. It had stilled on the brim of his hat. A farmer's hands. A poor farmer's hands. Mr. Cole, her voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked at her then finally reluctantly, and she saw what she'd half expected. Resignation. Not hunger, not cruelty, not the particular gleam of a man who thought he was getting something good. Just the flat, exhausted look of someone who had run out of options and was standing in the rubble of his last one. His eyes were gray, storm gray, the kind that held rain it couldn't release. "Do you have anything to say to me?" she asked. "Anything at all." The silence stretched. Then, "It's a hard life on the farm." His voice was quiet, rough with disuse, each word chosen with the care of a man who didn't say much and meant what he said. "Work from dawn till dark. House needs repairs I haven't had time to make. Winter comes early in the valley." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't kindness even. But it was honest, and in that moment Clara recognized it for what it was, a warning. He was telling her exactly what she'd be getting. Nothing. Nothing but survival. Barely that. "And if I refuse?" She already knew the answer, but she needed to hear him say it or not say it to understand the shape of what was being asked of her. "Then Thornton takes the house tomorrow." Her father's voice flat as stone. "Takes everything. Your mother and I'll be on the street, and you along with us." Her mother spoke then, two words raw as an open wound. "Clara, please." Two words carrying the weight of every sacrifice her mother had made, every beating endured, every dream buried beneath the daily work of surviving a marriage to a man who gambled away anything good that came within his reach. Clara heard them, felt something inside her break, not with a crack, but with the long, slow tearing of green wood. "What time?" she asked. The words tasted like ash. Her father exhaled. 2 o'clock. Reverend Mills can perform the ceremony this afternoon. Wear your good dress. Try to look, he gestured vaguely. Try to look like this was wanted. Try to look like something other than a debt being transferred. Ethan Cole stood then, unfolding to his full height, 6 feet at least, all lean muscle and angles. He settled his hat on his head and nodded once to her father, a movement that sealed the bargain as surely as any handshake. "I'll return at 1:30. Quietly, with the wagon. He left without looking at Clara again. She watched through the window as he climbed onto a wagon that had seen better decades, pulled by a single horse that looked as tired as the rest of the rig. The whole thing creaked as it rolled away, a sound like bones settling, like things breaking slowly under weight they were never meant to bear. She spent 3 hours in her room with needle and thread. The blue cotton dress she'd worn to church, to the handful of social occasions their declining finances had permitted, had a tear along the left seam she'd been meaning to mend for weeks. She mended it now, her stitches small and precise, each one a tiny act of control in a day that had stripped her of everything else. She worked in silence, refusing to think beyond the next stitch, the next breath. At 1:15, her mother brought water for washing. At 1:20, she helped Clara into the dress, fastening the long row of buttons with fingers that couldn't stop trembling. At 1:25, she tried to arrange Clara's dark blonde hair into something resembling bridal, but her hands shook too badly, and Clara finally took the brush and pulled her hair back into a simple knot at the base of her neck. "You don't have any flowers," her mother said, staring at Clara's reflection in the cracked mirror above the washstand, as if only now grasping the full weight of what was happening. "I don't need flowers. Every bride needs—" "I'm not a bride, Mama." Clara turned from the mirror, unable to bear the face she saw there, composed, dry-eyed, already gone, somewhere her body hadn't caught up to yet. "I'm a payment. Let's not pretend otherwise." The wagon arrived at 1:30 exactly. She heard it before she saw it, that same creak, that same tired horse. She walked downstairs with the measured steps of someone who had decided that if she was going to do this, she would do it without stumbling. Her father waited by the door in his funeral suit. The irony of that was not lost on her. Ethan stood beside the wagon. This time he did look at her, one quick, comprehensive glance that took in the mended dress, the simple hair, the face she'd kept carefully blank. Something moved across his features. Regret, maybe? Or recognition. Then he nodded once and offered his hand to help her up. His palm was calloused, warm, and careful. He handed her up like she was made of glass that might shatter, then climbed up beside her and took the reins with the same methodical care. Her parents climbed into the back, her mother clutching a handkerchief she'd already soaked through. The ride to the church took 15 minutes. No one spoke. The only sounds were the wagon wheels on packed earth, the horses' steady breathing, and the wind moving through late-season grass with a whisper that sounded like warnings. Clara looked at the landscape she'd known her whole life. The low hills dotted with sage, the creek running silver in the distance, the scattered buildings of Mercer Center huddled together against the vastness as if afraid of being forgotten. She was memorizing it, she realized. Saying goodbye to the girl she'd been, the one who'd walked these streets and imagined a different future. That girl was dying somewhere between the house and the church. Clara was learning to become whoever came after. The church was small, white clapboard with a bell tower that leaned slightly south as if tired of standing straight. Reverend Mills waited on the steps with his prayer book, his face carefully neutral. He'd married half the town and buried the other half, and he knew how to look at a rushed wedding without judgment, even when judgment was deserved. Inside the church held only two witnesses, the Reverend's wife and old Tom Brewster, the town clerk, who looked like he'd been dragged from his afternoon drink and didn't intend to stay any longer than legally required. Clara walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Even that felt like mockery, him giving her away as if she were a gift, as if this were anything other than a sail dressed up in scripture. The floorboards creaked under each step. Ethan stood at the front, hat in hands again, turning it in that same rotation. When Clara reached him, her father stepped back without a word, without even looking at her. And suddenly she was standing beside the stranger, and Reverend Mills was opening his prayer book, and the afternoon sun was slanting through dusty windows and illuminating absolutely nothing. "Do you, Ethan Cole, take this woman?" Clara stopped listening. She focused instead on staying upright, on breathing, on the dust motes turning in the light like they were dancing at a wedding that wasn't this one. She felt as though she were watching from a great distance, watching some other girl in a mended dress promise her life to a man whose first name she'd learned an hour ago. "Do you, Clara Whitmore, take this man?" The pause stretched, her mother's eyes on her back, her father's weight shifting, Ethan's stillness beside her, a held breath, patient as stone. She could say no, could walk out, could choose the street in starvation and whatever unknown darkness came after. Anything but this. But her mother's voice echoed, "Please, I do." The words tasted like copper, like blood, like the death of something she couldn't name. Ethan's response came quieter. "I do." There were no rings. The Reverend skipped forward, hurrying now, wanting this over as much as everyone else. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." Ethan looked at her. She gave the barest shake of her head. Relief flickered across his features before he turned to the Reverend. "That won't be necessary." Reverend Mills blinked, shrugged, closed his prayer book. "Very well, sign here. Both of you." Clara signed first, watching her old name appear one final time in her own handwriting. Clara Whitmore. She stared at it for a moment, then picked up the pen and signed again in the space for the new name. Clara Cole, a name she didn't recognize, attached to a life she didn't want, bound to a man she didn't know. The wagon pulled away from the church at 2:15 on a Sunday in September, and Clara did not look back. She stared straight ahead at the road unwinding before them, at the hills growing larger, at the future rushing toward her, whether she was ready or not. They rode in silence for an hour. The town fell behind. Open country replaced it, grassland dotted with sage mountains rising in the distance like promises no one intended to keep. The land here was beautiful in a harsh way. All wind-scoured simplicity, no softness to catch you when you fell. The farm's another mile. Clara nodded. Didn't trust her voice. "It's not much," Ethan continued. The words came slow and careful, like he was picking his way across uncertain ground. 40 acres, most of it stubborn. House needs work. Barn's worse. She let the silence hold a moment. Then, why did you do this? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why did you agree to this? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Same reason you did, I expect, he said finally. Desperation, and a shortage of better options. His honesty startled her. She'd expected lies, the comfortable fictions men told when they wanted something and didn't want to examine the wanting. Thornton holds my note too, he said. Different debt, same result. He gave me 60 days to pay, or he takes the farm. I can't earn that much by harvest. Not alone. He paused, jaw working. A wife means extra hands. Means I might have a chance. She let that settle. Why didn't you hire a farmhand? Can't pay wages. Don't have it. He didn't look at her. This way seemed. He stopped. But the implication hung between them ugly and clear. This way he got labor without wages. Bound by law. Unable to leave. You bought yourself a slave, she said. No. Sharp. Definite. I bought us both time. You needed out of your father's house. I needed help to save mine. It's not what I wanted, but it's what was possible. The farm appeared ahead, a small house weathered to gray, a barn listing dangerously to one-side fields that looked like they'd been fighting a losing battle with the elements for years. A single cow watched them approach with the mild interest of livestock that had seen plenty of bad situations and recognized another one. Welcome home, Mrs. Cole. The name sounded like a stranger's. He climbed down, tied the horse, and turned to help her. His hands were careful again, steady, deliberate, like he was afraid she'd bolt if he wasn't gentle enough. Inside the house was worse than the outside suggested. One main room serving as kitchen and living space. A separate bedroom barely larger than a closet. Everything worn down to the essence of survival. The stove was black iron and ancient. The table could seat two, if neither minded splinters. The floor was wood planks with gaps wide enough to see the ground beneath. Bedroom's yours, Ethan said, setting her bag, the one her mother had packed on the narrow bed. I'll sleep in the barn. Clara turned to look at him. Searched his face for the lie, the trick, the moment when he'd reveal what he actually wanted. But his face was just tired, lined with the same resignation she felt. And she realized he meant it. It's your house, she said slowly. Your bed. It's your wedding night. He moved toward the door. You should have privacy. We're married in law, maybe not in any way that matters. He paused at the threshold. There's food in the larder. Not much, but enough. Waters are from the well outside. Outhouse is behind the barn. I'll be up at dawn for chores. You can help if you want. Or not, that's up to you. What kind of marriage is this? The question came out smaller than she'd intended, younger. Like the girl she'd been this morning, asking what happened to the life she'd expected. Ethan leaned against the doorframe. For the first time that day, something crossed his face that wasn't resignation. Something quieter and sadder and more careful. The kind where we're both trying to survive, he said. I won't touch you, Clara. Won't demand anything except the work we both need to do to keep this place running. You're safe here. That's the only promise I can make. Why should I believe you? Because I've got no reason to lie. We're stuck with each other now. Might as well be honest about it. He left. The door closed gently behind him, and Clara stood alone in a stranger's house, wearing a wedding dress that smelled like her mother's tears, listening to the silence settle around her like snow. She didn't cry. She'd learned years ago that tears were a luxury. Instead, she unlaced her good dress, hung it carefully on the nail that served as a closet, and dressed in the work clothes her mother had packed. Then she walked outside. The September evening was cooling fast, that high-altitude cold that came on like a judgment. Ethan was in the barn. She could hear him talking to the horse in a low, steady voice, the kind of voice you'd use with something skittish that might bolt. Clara walked to the well instead, drew water, let the bucket hang heavy in her hands while she stared at the mountains going purple in the dying light. She noticed then what she hadn't noticed in the chaos of the day. The fields to the west were not the same color as the fields to the east. The eastern fields, the ones she'd passed on the road in, had the golden gray of harvested land, stubbled and resting. But the western fields held a different kind of failure. The soil there was pale, almost white in the fading light, desiccated in a way that suggested not drought, but deprivation. Something had been taken from it. Not this year, over years. The land's been working hard and eating little too, she thought, just like its owner. She carried the water inside, set it on the washstand, stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror above it. Same face, different everything else. Through the walls, thin as they were, she heard the wind picking up, whistling through the gaps in the boards, carrying the scent of sage and coming winter. She heard chickens settling for the night, the cow shifting in her stall, the distant cry of a hawk hunting in the last light. And she heard nothing from the barn. No footsteps, no demands, just silence. And that strange, improbable promise of safety from a man who had every legal right to demand otherwise. Clara lay down on the bed, still dressed for the work tomorrow would bring, and stared at the ceiling until dark swallowed it. Her wedding night passed in silence, in solitude, in the slow understanding that whatever came next, it wouldn't be what she'd feared. It might be worse, it might be better, but it would be hers to survive or not, and that was something. Dawn came gray and cold, seeping through the gaps in the walls like water through a failing dam. Clara woke to cold that had settled into her bones, the thin blanket, no match for September, turning toward October at elevation. For one confused moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory returned with the weight of stone and she understood everything. She was Clara Cole now, the wife of a poor farmer, sleeping alone in a stranger's bed while her husband spent the night in a barn because he'd promised her safety and apparently meant it. She sat up, breath misting in the cold air, and reached for her work dress. Through the window, she could already see Ethan in the yard below, carrying water to the cow, his movements efficient and practiced. He'd been up before first light. She dressed quickly and went outside. The morning air bit at her face, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and livestock and earth that hadn't seen rain in too long. Ethan glanced up at her approach, nodded once, went back to his work without speaking. She stood awkwardly in the yard, uncertain of her place in this new choreography, until he finally paused and looked at her directly. "You know how to milk a cow?" "Yes. Chickens need feeding. Eggs need gathering. Grain's in the barn. Second stall." It wasn't conversation, it was instruction. Clara nodded and moved toward the barn. She found the grain, scattered it for the chickens, searched the nesting boxes methodically. 6 eggs still warm. She carried them carefully to the house, then returned for the milk bucket. The cow, she'd ask its name if it had one, stood patient while Clara settled onto the stool and began the rhythmic pull and release. Her hands remembered from childhood, back when her family had owned livestock before her father gambled away anything that could be sold. The milk came in steady streams, foaming into the bucket, and Clara found something almost meditative in the repetition. When she finished, Ethan was waiting outside the barn. "I'll strain it," he said, taking the bucket from her. "There's coffee on the stove, bread in the tin. Help yourself. Have you eaten? I'll eat after the morning work's done." Clara followed him to the house, watched as he strained the milk through clean cloth, his movements practiced and sure. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint bitter as regret, but it was hot, and she wrapped her hands around the tin cup and let the warmth seep into her fingers. "The cow's name is Bessie," Ethan said without looking up. "She's old but steady. Good milk." He paused. "The chickens don't have names. Seems pointless. When we eat them." It was the most he'd said to her since the wedding. Clara sipped her coffee and studied him in the morning light, the way his dark hair stuck up in places, the shadow of stubble down along his jaw, the careful distance he maintained between them, even in the small space of the kitchen. "Why did you really do this?" she asked quietly. "The truth, not the version you told me yesterday." He was quiet for a long moment. He finished with the milk, set the jar in the cool box outside. When he came back in, he poured himself coffee and stood across the table, both hands wrapped around his cup. "My parents died of fever," he said. "The winter I turned 27. Left me the land and the debt, and not much else. I've been working myself half to death, trying to keep it running. Every year I fall a little further behind." He took a long drink of coffee. Grimaced. Thornton knew it. "He's been circling for years, waiting for me to fail. Last month he called in my note early, changed the terms. 60 days to pay, or he takes everything." A pause. "That's not legal." "It is if you know the right judge. Thornton knows them all. He set the cup down. I couldn't pay. Couldn't even come close. Then your father came to me, said if I married his daughter and settled his debt with Thornton, he'd work off the difference, help with harvest. Whatever I needed. Clara's stomach turned cold. My father agreed to work for you. That was the deal, and you believed him? Ethan's laugh was short and bitter. Number one, I figured he'd disappear the minute the ink dried on the marriage certificate. Men like your father don't keep promises. He looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted toward apology. But I thought even if he lied, I'd still have a chance. With two people working, I might be able to save the harvest. Might be able to pay Thornton. It was a desperate plan. He paused. But I'm a desperate man. Clara sat down, let the full weight of what he was saying settle over her. You married me for labor. I married you because we both needed escape, and this was the only door open to either of us. I won't apologize for that. But I won't pretend it was anything noble. He met her eyes. There's something else you should know. She waited. Your father's debt. The $80 he owed Thornton. His hands tightened around the cup. I paid it before the wedding. Used the last of my savings. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara sat very still. She did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding since yesterday, the number her father had cited, the number she'd somehow not wanted to calculate into anything specific. $80, she said. Yes, she looked down at her hands on the table, calloused already from a lifetime of her father's house. She thought about good horses in this territory, about what a month's skilled wages looked like, about the specific, precise mathematics of what she had been worth to the man who was supposed to have loved her most. Less than a good horse, she said. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The knowledge settled into Clara's chest and hardened there, not into rage, not yet, into something colder and quieter. She had known in the abstract that she was being traded. Now she knew the exact price. The number gave the humiliation a shape she could hold, and somehow holding it made it almost bearable. He won't come, she said finally. My father. Whatever he promised you, he won't come to work. I know, you knew yesterday. Yes, then it's just us. Just us. Ethan agreed. The words fell into the quiet kitchen and rested there. Two words containing the entire weight of what they were now, strangers, partners, something without a name yet. Clara picked up her coffee cup, drank, set it down. What needs doing first, Chaya? The harness had snapped clean through near the collar leather old and stressed past its limit. Ethan showed her the damage wordlessly, holding up the broken strap, and Clara took it from him and turned it in her hands, testing the weight, examining the break. The leather was sound on either side. Just the joint, just the place where two things met and the stress had concentrated. I'll need tools, she said, and rivets. Workbench in the corner. She spent the morning in the barn working leather with an awl and hammer her hands, remembering skills her grandfather had taught her. In the years before everything went wrong, back when she was small enough to believe the world held more good than bad. The work was precise and demanding, and she welcomed it. Welcomed anything that kept her hands busy and her mind focused on something she could actually fix. Around midday, Ethan came in carrying bread and cheese. He set it on the workbench beside her without speaking, then paused, looking at the harness she'd already half repaired. His expression shifted into something she hadn't seen on his face before. That's good work. My grandfather was a saddle maker. He taught me. Wish I'd known. Something almost wry entered his voice. I've been ruining leather for 3 years trying to fix things myself. Clara allowed herself a small, grim smile. Well, now you know. They ate in silence on hay bales, the barn around them full of dust motes and thin sunlight and the sound of Bessie chewing her cud. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile. It was something in between, two people finding their footing on uncertain ground. Your father didn't come, Ethan said after a while. No, he won't. She kept her eyes on the bread in her hands. You'll never see him again. Ethan nodded slowly, as if he'd expected nothing different. Then it's just us, Clara agreed, and felt the full weight of those two words settle into her bones, not as defeat this time, but as something stranger and more complicated. The beginning of a fact she hadn't chosen but might yet learn to live inside. The afternoon passed in more work. Clara finished the harness, then moved to the house, searching for tasks that needed doing. The list was endless gaps in the walls that let in cold, and insects a stove that leaked smoke windows that hadn't been washed in years. She started with what she could manage, scrubbing the stove, washing the windows, sweeping floors that hadn't seen a broom since Ethan's mother died. The work was hard and endless, but it gave her something she hadn't had in years: purpose. And purpose was something you could hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping through your fingers. October 1882. The days began to blur together the way hard work always makes days blur. Not into monotony, but into a kind of rhythm, like the rhythm of the harness repair, like the rhythm of milk pulling from Bessie's flanks in the cold morning dark. Clara woke before dawn. She fed the chickens. She milked the cow. She made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and set bread to rise while Ethan worked the fields. They divided the labor without discussion, the way people who can't afford inefficiency learn to operate through observation, through trial, through the silent negotiation of two people who need each other to survive and haven't yet decided what else they might be. Clara learned the farm the way she'd learned her grandfather's leather work, by paying attention. She learned that the eastern fields drank water differently than the western ones. She learned that Bessie produced more milk if you talked to her, and that the chickens had a pecking order as rigid and unforgiving as any society she'd ever navigated. She learned that Ethan checked the wagon wheels every morning with the obsessive care of a man who knew exactly what losing a wheel on a loaded harvest wagon would cost him. She learned that the western fields, those pale, desiccated acres she'd noticed on her first evening, troubled him. He never said so directly, but she caught him standing at the edge of them, sometimes in the early morning when he thought she wasn't watching, staring at the soil with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the look of a man who keeps doing the math and keeps getting the same wrong answer. The land was different, once he said one morning, catching her studying the pale earth alongside him. He spoke to the field rather than to her. My father said these were the best acres on the property when he broke ground here. Good water retention, rich soil. He paused. 3 years ago, something changed. I don't know what. The yield started falling. I've tried everything I know. Clara said nothing, but she filed the observation away carefully, precisely the way she filed everything that didn't yet make sense. So, 3 weeks into the marriage, Ethan came in from the fields at noon instead of midday, walking too fast, his face stripped of its usual careful control. "Thornton's here." Clara heard the wagon before she reached the door, the confident clatter of expensive wheels on the road leading to their property, a sound entirely unlike the apologetic creak of their own rig. She stepped outside into the October air and watched Samuel Thornton dismount from his horse with the ease of a man who had never once questioned his right to be anywhere. He was well dressed in the manner of men who wanted you to know exactly how much they'd spent. His smile was already in place as he walked toward them, the particular smile of a man who enjoys inspecting things he plans to acquire. "Just checking on my investment," he said when he reached them. His gaze moved over the farm with a proprietary sweep that made Clara's jaw tighten. "Making sure you're working hard to meet your obligations." "We're working," Ethan said. Flat, both hands loose at his sides. "Glad to hear it." Thornton's attention shifted to Clara, and his smile widened into something that had teeth behind it. "Mrs. Cole, married life treating you well?" "Well enough." "Glad to hear it." He looked around at the fields, the leaning barn, the weathered house with the expression of a man calculating salvage value. "Would be a shame if this all fell apart. Though I should mention I've already had an inquiry. Man from Laramie, looking to expand his holdings. He's offered a fair price." "The farm isn't for sale," Ethan said. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Cole." Thornton said it pleasantly, as if correcting a child. "You just haven't found your price yet." He turned toward his horse, then paused as if something had just occurred to him, though Clara could see it was entirely calculated, the pause of a man who had rehearsed this moment. His gaze moved to the western fence line, to the point where the land began its gentle slope toward the water channel that ran along the property's edge. It lasted only a moment, less than a moment. A flicker of something, satisfaction maybe, or confirmation, that crossed his face before the pleasant mask settled back into place. Clara saw it. She filed it away with everything else. "See that you have that payment ready in November," Thornton said. "I'd hate to see this nice little farm go to someone who'd appreciate it more." He rode off, and Clara stood watching him go with something cold and still settling in her chest. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling of pieces beginning to align toward a picture she didn't yet want to see clearly. "He's been planning this," she said. "I know." Ethan's voice was rough. And unless we can harvest fast enough, then we work faster. They did. Whoa. The harvest consumed them. There was no other word for it. The work swallowed daylight whole and came for the hours before sunrise too, until Clara's hands had passed through blistered and into something tougher, until her shoulders had found a new baseline for pain, until the simple act of falling into bed each night felt like the body's most merciful mercy. Ethan taught her to use the scythe the proper stance, the arc of the swing, the rhythm that kept the blade true. She learned despite the ache, despite the blister's return each time she pushed past what her hands had already hardened to. She learned because learning was the only thing that stood between them and losing everything. They worked side by side through October, and somewhere in the work they began to talk. Not about the marriage, not about what they were to each other or what they weren't, or the careful architecture of distance they'd both maintained since the first night. They talked about the things directly in front of them, which field to harvest first, which rows could wait, where the soil was best and why. They talked about the crop, and then, because the crop came from the land, they talked about the land, and then because the land had belonged to his parents. They talked about his parents. My father came from Pennsylvania, Ethan said one evening, walking the rows at dusk when the light was too low to work, but neither of them had turned toward the house yet. Came west with nothing but a wagon, a wife, and more confidence than any man has a right to. Something softened briefly in his expression. My mother said he proposed to her in a letter before he'd even seen her face. Said he needed a woman who was brave enough to build something from nothing. Was she? She was braver than he was. He said it simply without embarrassment. The first winter almost killed them. 3 other homesteaders gave up and went back east. My parents stayed. He looked at the fields in the fading light. I keep thinking they survived that first winter on stubbornness and prayers. I should be able to manage this. You're managing, Clara said. Barely counts. He looked at her then. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. She turned toward the house before either of them had to decide what to do with the moment. She found him in the barn on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week. She'd come looking for the mending shears. She'd left them on the workbench and couldn't find another pair. And she pushed the barn door open quietly, the way you move in a space where animals sleep, and stopped. Ethan was sitting on a hay bale with his face in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. For a moment, she thought he was laughing. Then she understood. He hadn't heard her. His back was to the door, and his grief was the entirely private kind, the sort of person only allows themselves when they're certain no one is watching. In his right hand, hanging between his knees, he held a piece of folded paper. Old paper, soft at the creases from having been folded and unfolded many times. Clara stood at the threshold and made a choice. She stepped inside, sat down on the hay bale beside him, and waited. He heard her, then went very still. The particular stillness of a man who had been caught at something he considered shameful. A long moment passed. Then, without looking up, he spoke. I'm sorry, this isn't... He stopped. Tried again. I don't usually. You're exhausted, she said. I'm failing. He raised his head and his eyes were red, his face tracked with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. I've been working this farm for 3 years, and I'm further in debt than when I started. My parents left me their life's work, and I'm going to lose it. And I dragged you into this mess because I was desperate and selfish, and I thought maybe somehow... He stopped again. I'm so tired, Clara. I'm so goddamn tired. She understood that tiredness. Had felt it herself every day of her life in her father's house, that bone-deep exhaustion that comes from fighting battles you can't win, from trying to hold together things that are already broken. What's in the letter, she asked quietly. He looked at the paper in his hand. A moment passed. My father wrote it the winter before he died. His voice went rough at the edges. He knew he was sick. He said things he hadn't said before, about the land, about what it meant to him. He opened the letter, though he clearly didn't need to read it. He had it memorized. He wrote, don't let it fall into the hands of men who only understand land as money. The land is our family. It holds everyone we ever were. Clara looked at the letter, at his hands holding it, at the way his fingers had gone white at the knuckles, trying to keep hold of something that was slipping anyway. How much do we need, she asked. He looked at her. What? How much? To pay Thornton. Exactly. He blinked, shifted. The grief was still on his face, but something else was moving underneath it, the reflex of a man who had learned to keep functioning even when the ground was falling away. $300 by mid-November. How much will the harvest bring? If we're lucky, 200. Maybe 250 if prices hold and we don't lose too much to weather. So we need another 50 to 100 in 8 weeks. There's nothing left to sell, he said. The wagon's falling apart. Bessie's worth maybe $20. The chicken's another 5. It still leaves us short. Clara sat with the arithmetic for a moment, turning it the way she turned a piece of broken leather, looking for the place where the fix could be made. What about taking the harvest to Cheyenne? He stared at her. That's 3 days' travel each way, a week total. We don't have, we have 4 weeks until payments due. If we can get even $20 more per load, $20 won't be enough. Then we get 40. 50. Whatever the difference is between Morrison's prices here and the market price in Cheyenne. She turned to look at him directly. Ethan, we can sit here and accept defeat, or we can fight until the very last second. I'd rather fight. He studied her face in the dim barn light. She watched him do the thing he did when he was making a real decision, jaw working, eyes gone somewhere interior, and then watched him come back. All right, he said, we'll take it to Cheyenne. Clara nodded, stood, retrieved the mending shears from the workbench. She was at the barn door when he said quietly, thank you. For just thank you. I'm not doing it for thanks, she said. I'm doing it because it's our harvest and our land. And I'll be damned if we quit before we've tried everything. She walked back toward the house and didn't look back. But she was aware for the first time of the words she'd used without thinking. They left before dawn 5 weeks after the wedding, the wagon loaded with every sack of wheat they'd managed to thresh and winnow in the desperate push of the past week. Bessie left in the neighbor's care, the house locked behind them, the road to Cheyenne stretching ahead in the gray pre-dawn like a sentence they hadn't finished reading. Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon seat watching the sun rise over the eastern mountains and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, something more modest and more durable. The quiet satisfaction of having decided to act. Tell me about the man who taught you leatherwork, Ethan said after they'd been an hour on the road. Clara looked at the mountains. My grandfather, my mother's father. She paused, adjusting to the unfamiliar sensation of being asked about herself. He had a shop in Ohio before they moved west. He used to say that leather is honest material. It tells you exactly how it's been treated. You can't fake good leather work. Either the joints hold or they don't. He sounds like a man worth knowing. He was the only man in my life who ever treated me like I was worth educating. She heard the flatness in her own voice and softened it deliberately. He died when I was 12. After that, my father's, she stopped. Things changed after that. Ethan didn't press, didn't offer consolation. Just let the statement exist in the air between them, which was she was discovering something he was unusually good at. My mother wanted me to be a teacher, he said after a while. I was going to study for it, saved enough for the first year of training. A pause, then the fever came and the savings went to the doctor, and after they were gone, there was no more money and no more parents and 40 acres of land that needed somebody to work it. Do you regret it? The teaching. He thought about it honestly, which she'd learned was the only way he approached questions. Sometimes. On the evenings when the work's done and the house is quiet, I miss the idea of it. The students I never had. He glanced at her briefly. What did I want? She'd never been directly asked before. The question sat strangely in her mouth, like a word in a foreign language she'd studied, but never spoken aloud. I wanted to be someone who made things, useful things, something you could hold in your hands and know was solid. She looked down at her calloused hands. My grandfather's work there were saddles he made that lasted 30 years. People still had them. That seemed like a good kind of permanence. You could still do that. She looked at him. I'm a farmer's wife now, a farmer's wife who's better at leatherwork than the farmer. Something moved in his voice that might on another face have been teasing. Seems like those things aren't mutually exclusive. Clara looked at the road ahead and said nothing, but she turned the thought over quietly and didn't put it entirely down. Pakistan. The second night in the road, the clouds that had been building since noon finally opened. Not snow-cold rain, the kind that falls in sheets and means business turning the road to mud that sucked at the wagon wheels. and made Jack the borrowed horse lay his ears flat and push forward with the grim determination of an animal that understood consequences. Ethan drove for another hour trying to find shelter before finally pulling the wagon into a shallow depression near a stand of cottonwoods that offered minimal protection from the wind. They worked together in the downpour without speaking, covering the wheat with extra canvas, securing the ties, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had stopped needing to narrate the task. By the time they finished, both were soaked through. The temperature was dropping. Their breath came in visible clouds. "We need to get warm," Ethan said. "Both of us." Clara understood what he wasn't saying. The wagon bed, crowded with grain sacks, barely enough room for two people, was the only dry space available. The blankets were in there, and hypothermia was indifferent to the careful social architecture they had constructed over 5 weeks. "I know," she said simply. They climbed into the wagon. Clara changed into her spare dress in the darkness. Ethan turned away, the rain drumming a steady rhythm on the canvas above them. Then they lay down with both blankets over them and the grain sacks arranged as best they could manage, and the cold receded slowly, not all at once, but in increments, as body heat accumulated in the small shared space. Clara became aware gradually of various things: the steadiness of Ethan's breathing, the warmth of him, which was considerable, all that lean, work-hardened bulk radiating heat she needed, the way her body had oriented itself toward him without her having decided to, the way cold always makes bodies seek warmth, simple as gravity. "I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "This isn't, I know what it is," Clara said. "It's survival." A pause, then yes. The rain hammered the canvas. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, the wind moved with a sound like breathing. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said. "Yes. Do you regret it?" "Marrying me." She lay still for a moment, thought about it honestly, the way he'd taught her by example to think about things. 6 weeks ago, she would have said yes without hesitation, would have said it with a fierceness born of humiliation and powerlessness. But she was lying in a wagon in a rainstorm 40 miles from home, having spent 5 weeks working harder than she'd ever worked, and she found the answer wasn't as simple as it had been. "I regret how it happened," she said. "I regret being sold like property, but regret marrying you specifically?" She paused, searching for the precise truth the way he'd searched for a load-bearing beam. "No, I don't regret that." She felt him exhale, a slow, careful release of something he'd been holding. "I don't regret it either," he said. "Even though I brought you into this mess, even though you deserve better." A pause. He stopped, started again. "You've been the best thing about this whole disaster." Clara's throat tightened. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her before. Not in those terms, so plain and unornamented, offered without agenda. "You kept every promise you made me," she said quietly. "That's more than most men would do." "Most men are fools." "Most men are," she agreed, and felt something warm spread through her chest that had nothing to do with shared blankets and everything to do with this quiet, exhausted man who had given her safety when he had nothing else left to give. They fell asleep in the rain, and Clara's last conscious thought was that this felt right in a way nothing in her life had felt right for a very long time. Later that night, she didn't know what hour she woke to find the rain had stopped. The canvas above them was still, and through a gap at the corner, she could see stars. Ethan was asleep behind her, trending, one arm resting near, but not quite touching her shoulder, his breathing slow and even. She lay still, listening to the silence the rain had left behind, and thought. About Thornton's eyes on the water channel, about the pale western fields, about Fletcher's comment, the one she'd turned over 100 times already in her mind. Thornton's funny about water. Farmers with water problems seemed to come up a lot in his dealings. She'd been waiting for certainty before she said anything. She wanted more than instinct, more than a look she might have misread, more than a sentence from a stranger who might not even have meant what she'd heard in it. She wasn't there yet, but she was getting closer. Cheyenne rose out of the prairie the next afternoon like a statement. Broad streets, solid buildings, the sound of commerce and the railroad, and people who had somewhere to be. Clara had never seen a city this size. She registered its scale with the part of her that was still 19 and had barely left Mercer County, then set that part aside and focused on the task. The grain exchange was near the railroad depot, a large warehouse smelling of dust and commerce, and the particular desperation that accumulates wherever people bring things they need to sell, and encounter men who know it. They waited in line, watched other farmers ahead of them negotiate, accept, drive away with varying expressions. Clara watched the buyer Morrison, stocky, sharp-eyed, moving with the easy confidence of a man who knew he held the advantage, and felt her jaw tighten before they'd even spoken. When their turn came, Morrison examined their wheat with a practiced eye. Pinched it, smelled it, ran it through his fingers. "Quality's decent," he said finally. "Not premium." "It's good wheat," Ethan said. "Harvested careful. Kept dry. I can see that. Still supply's been heavy this season?" "Prices are down." Morrison's eyes moved to the slate on his desk where he did his calculations with the practiced speed of a man who had done this 10,000 times. "I'll give you 210. The number hit like a physical blow. Clara did the arithmetic instantly, 210 of 300. $90 short. They'd traveled 3 days through mud and rain for this. "That's robbery," she said before she'd consciously decided to speak. Morrison looked at her with amusement and something darker beneath it. "That wheat's worth what I'm willing to pay for it, Mrs. Cole," she said. "And that wheat is worth considerably more than 210, and you know it. Fair market is what you can get. I'm offering 210. Take it or try your luck elsewhere." They tried elsewhere. Spent the rest of the afternoon going from buyer to buyer across the exchange, hearing different versions of the same story. Prices down, supply heavy, 210 was the market. By evening, standing outside the last warehouse while the sun set behind Cheyenne's rooftops, they'd confirmed it 210 was all they were going to get. 210, Clara said. The word tasted like defeat. "We're 90 short," Ethan said. His face had gone gray. "We've done everything, and we're still 90 short. Then we sell the wheat and figure out the rest. There is no rest to figure out." His voice had gone flat in the way that meant he was holding something back, anger or grief or both. "We're 90 short with 3 weeks to deadline. We have nothing left to sell. Then we'll find somewhere, Clara." "We didn't come this far to quit." She turned to face him and felt all the fury and fear of the past 6 weeks concentrate into something clean and hard. "We sell the wheat, we take the 210. Then we go home and we find the rest. But we don't quit here in this muddy street just because a man who cheats farmers is offering us less than we're owed." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face, something that had been closed opened just slightly. "All right," he said. "We sell the wheat." They went back to Morrison, accepted his price, watched him weigh the harvest and count out bills that felt too light for the weight of work they represented. $210. Clara folded the money carefully and put it in the inner pocket of her dress against her skin, where she'd have to be dead before anyone could take it. They found a boarding house near the exchange, cheap, clean enough, with a meal included in the price. Clara ate without tasting and climbed the stairs to the small room with both of them too tired for conversation. Ethan stood at the window staring out at Cheyenne's gaslit streets, and Clara could see the defeat settling into him the way cold settles into poorly insulated walls through every gap, relentless until it reaches the bones. She moved to stand beside him. "We'll find the money," she said. "How we've sold everything we have, I don't know yet." She kept her voice steady. "But we've solved problems we didn't know how to solve before. We'll solve this one too." He looked at her. In the dim light from the street below, she saw something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not just exhaustion and worry, but something underneath those things, something that had been gathering for weeks and was now too close to the surface to hide entirely. "What you said," he began slowly, "about not quitting, about fighting until the last second." He stopped, started again. That's not how I expected you to be. How did you expect me to be?" "Broken," he said honestly. "I thought, given what happened, given how this started, I thought you'd be surviving it, going through the motions, waiting for it to be over." A pause. "But you're not doing that." "No," Clara said. "I'm not." He reached out then carefully, deliberately, and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm. His grip was firm but not tight. The gesture of a man who was offering something and knew it might not be accepted. She let her hand stay in his. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up." "Thank you," she said, "for being worth not giving up for." They stood at the window, hand in hand, while Cheyenne moved through its evening below them, and neither of them spoke again, and neither of them needed to. They were loading the wagon the next morning, preparing for the long ride home with $210 and a debt that was still 90 short when a man approached. Older, well-dressed in the practical way of men who had money and used it for function rather than display. He studied their wagon, their wheat sacks, their faces with the appraising attention of someone who had learned to read situations quickly. "You folks just sell to Morrison," Ethan turned. "Why?" "Because Morrison's been underpaying farmers all season." The man offered his hand. "James Fletcher. I run a grain cooperative. We've been trying to put Morrison out of business by offering fair prices to farmers he's been squeezing." Clara felt something shift in her chest. How fair? $3 a bushel for good wheat properly stored. Fletcher's eyes moved to their wagon. "What did he pay you?" 2.5, Ethan said. Fletcher's jaw tightened. "How many bushels? 84. He did the arithmetic quickly. "So he paid you 210 when your wheat was worth 252. That's $42 he stole from you." He said the word stole without any particular drama, just naming the thing precisely. "Can we get it back?" Clara asked immediately. "Not from Morrison. He's got the law in his pocket." Fletcher paused. "But I'm heading east with a rail shipment in 2 days. I need quality wheat to fill my cars. If you have more to sell, I'll pay you fair price." "We sold everything we had," Ethan said. "Nothing on your farm. Nothing at all." Clara turned to Ethan. She watched him understand what she was thinking before she said, "Saw the moment he registered it, and the moment he rejected it, and the moment he pulled it back and held it up in the light of their current situation." "The seed grain," she said. His face went through several things in quick succession. "That's for spring planting. Without it, we can't grow next year's crop. Without it, we don't have a farm to plant on." She kept her voice level, not pressing, just naming the arithmetic the way Fletcher had named Morrison's theft. "If we sell it, we save the land. We can figure out seed later." Ethan was quiet. She watched him do what she'd watched him do in the barn, go somewhere interior. Weigh the thing honestly, come back with an answer. He turned to Fletcher. "We have 25 bushels of seed grain back on our farm. High quality, kept dry. If we can get it here in 5 days, will you still buy it at $3? "Absolutely. That's $75, Clara said. Her mind was moving fast now. "Plus the 210 we have, that's 285. We'd still be 15 short." Fletcher studied them both. The silence lasted long enough that Clara began calculating what else could possibly be sold or traded or offered. Then Fletcher reached into his vest pocket. "Here," he said. He counted out bills, $20, and pressed them into Ethan's hand. "Consider it an advance on the seed grain you'll bring me." Ethan stared at the money. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've watched Morrison and Thornton and men like them bleed this territory dry for too long." Fletcher's voice was even. "Because your wheat is good quality, which tells me you're good farmers, which means I want you as suppliers for years to come. And because I remember what it felt like to be one bad season away from losing everything." He closed Ethan's fingers around the bills. "Bring me that seed grain. We'll call it even." They left Cheyenne with $230. 90 short had become 70 short, and 70 short had become nothing because they had the seed grain at home and Fletcher waiting and a road they already knew how to travel. Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon seat, watching the mountains come back into view as they headed north, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Something more structural than happiness. The sensation of a foundation being laid one stone at a time, none of them light, but each one placed where it needed to go. "We're going to make it," she said. "We might," Ethan said carefully. Then after a moment, "Yes, I think we are." He reached over without looking at her and covered her hand with his on the wagon seat. Not the tentative gesture of last night, something more settled, more sure. She turned her hand over and held on. The road home unwound before them in the October light, and above them the sky was the particular blue of autumn in Wyoming, vast and clear and full of what might yet be possible. November 1882 and after, they returned to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon with $230 and 4 days left before Fletcher's deadline. The house looked different to Clara than it had when they left, not changed dramatically, but seen differently. The weathered gray of the siding, the listing barn, the pale western fields, all of it had the quality of something she'd learned to see clearly only by going away from it. It was a failing farm on the edge of everything. It was also, she realized with a quietness that surprised her home. "We need to move fast," Ethan said. "Get the seed grain loaded tonight. Leave at first light. I'll start packing supplies. They worked through the evening in the lamplit kitchen, moving with the efficiency of two people who had stopped needing to coordinate out loud. Clara packed food for the road while Ethan brought the seed grain sacks in from the grain store and checked each one for moisture damage. None. 27 bushels of carefully stored wheat seed representing 3 years of Ethan selecting for the strongest heads, the most resilient grain. $81 at Fletcher's price, which brought their total to $311. $11 more than Thornton's demand. Clara sat down at the table while Ethan was outside and looked at that number for a long moment. $311, earned through harvest, in a 3-day drive through rain, and an honest buyer in a city full of dishonest ones, in the sale of their only seed for next spring. $11 to spare. She pressed her hand flat against the table, felt the wood rough and splintered the table of a poor farm, the table of people who had survived things they hadn't expected to survive. $11, she said aloud to no one. Then she stood and went back to packing. The second trip to Cheyenne took 2.5 days. The road was drier, the weather held, and they knew the way, now knew where to rest. Jack knew which creek crossings were reliable, knew that the best campsite was a flat stretch of ground 3 miles south of the first ridge, where the grass was thick enough to make adequate bedding and the trees broke the wind from the north. They made camp there on the first evening, and after the fire was lit and the food eaten and Jack unhitched and settled, they sat together in the kind of silence that had become over the past weeks, not empty but full. Ethan reached into the front of the wagon and brought out a small book. She'd seen it before, glimpsed it in the shelf above his bed, noticed it among the 3 volumes that represented his entire library. A slim book cloth covered the spine, worn to near illegibility. He set it on the ground between them, without explanation. Clara picked it up, opened it. Poetry. She didn't recognize the author. The name on the title page was worn past reading, but the poems themselves were short and plain-spoken, the language of people who worked with their hands and found beauty in plain things. She read one, then another. The firelight was just enough. She didn't read them aloud. He didn't ask her to. They simply sat there, both of them, watching the fire while she turned pages, and he stared into the middle distance with the look of a man who was allowing himself to rest for the first time in a long time. The fire burned down. Stars came out above the cottonwoods. Neither of them spoke, and in that silence Clara felt something she could only describe later to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts, as recognition, the sensation of having found in this improbable and difficult place a person whose silences felt like home. She closed the book and set it between them again. Ethan looked at it, then at her. Something moved in his face. "My father's," he said. "The only book of his I kept." Clara nodded. That was all. That was enough. They slept apart that night, and the weather was fine, there was no emergency, and neither of them had yet found the language for what was happening between them. But when she woke before dawn, she found that she'd reached toward his warmth in her sleep, and that he unconsciously had moved closer. She lay still in the early dark, listening to his breathing, and didn't move away. Fletcher was waiting at the grain exchange. He inspected the seed grain with the care he gave everything thorough, unhurried, his hands moving through the wheat with the practiced attention of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at. "Better than the harvest grain," he said, nodding. "This is good stock. You've been selecting carefully." 3 years, Ethan said. His voice was level, but Clara heard what was underneath it, the grief of a man selling something he'd cultivated with intention, handing it to a stranger because there was no other way. Fletcher heard it too. He counted out $81 in bills and coins, then paused, studied them both with a directness that wasn't unkind. "You folks have impressed me," he said. "Most farmers who get caught in Thornton's trap never recover. You not only recovered, you're still standing, and you're bringing me quality product." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a small card. "This is my associate in Laramie, Peter Calloway. He runs a feed and seed operation. Show him this card, tell him I sent you. He'll extend you credit for spring seed at fair rates." Clara took the card with hands that had steadied themselves through sheer practice. "Why are you helping us?" "Because Thornton and men like Morrison have been running this territory for too long by making sure that honest farmers can never quite get ahead." Fletcher's voice was even. "And because your work speaks for itself, I want you as suppliers for years to come." He paused. Bring me a good harvest next fall, Mrs. Cole. We will, she said. They left Cheyenne with $311 and a business card that might represent the future. The ride home was different, again lighter somehow, despite the exhaustion. They talked about the spring, about what they'd plant and where and what repairs the house needed before winter closed the valley. They talked about the chicken operation Clara wanted to expand and about whether the barn's south wall could be reinforced without tearing the whole thing down, and about the western fields. I keep thinking about those fields, Clara said on the second day. The yield's been dropping for 3 years. I've tried, I know what you've tried. She kept her eyes on the mountains ahead. I've been thinking about something else. Something I noticed on the first night I arrived. A pause. The soil color is wrong, Ethan. It's not drought. The color is different from what you'd see with drought. It looks like something is being taken from it. She paused. Like the water isn't reaching it the way it should. He was quiet. And I've been thinking about Thornton, she continued. About the way he looked at the water channel when he visited. You were watching his face, you were angry, and you missed it. But I saw it. He looked at the channel the way a man looks at something he already knows the answer to. Ethan didn't speak for a long time. That channel runs along the western property line, he said finally. Feeds the irrigation for those fields. Yes. If something were blocking it, the western fields would starve slowly. Over years. Not all at once, that would be obvious. Just gradually. Pale soil, dropping yield, a farmer who works harder every year and falls further behind because the land itself is being deprived of what it needs. She let that sit. A farmer who looks like he's failing when actually he's been sabotaged. The word landed between them like a stone in still water. That's not possible, Ethan said, but his voice had gone careful in a way that meant he was considering whether it was. I don't have proof yet, Clara said. I want to look at the channel before we do anything else, before we go to Thornton, before we say a word to anyone. She looked at him. But if I'm right, then I've been fighting the wrong enemy for 3 years. His voice had gone very quiet. I've been thinking I was failing, thinking I wasn't good enough, thinking my parents would be ashamed of. You weren't failing, Clara said. You were being prevented from succeeding. Those are not the same thing. He looked at her. His jaw was tight, his eyes too bright. He looked away before either of them had to acknowledge what was in them. Let's look at the channel, he said. They reached the farm on a gray afternoon November, coming down from the mountains with its early dark and its promise of cold. Ethan unhitched Jack and saw to the livestock while Clara made the walk to the western fence line, lone in the last of the afternoon light. The water channel ran along the property's western edge, a man-made ditch 8 inches deep designed to carry water from the main creek to the lower fields. She'd mapped it in her memory over weeks of walking the farm's perimeter, observing filing things away. She found the blockage 40 yards from the main intake. It wasn't dramatic, a large flat stone, the kind that occurred naturally in this country, the kind a man might shift into position and walk away from without leaving any evidence of deliberate intent. Wedged precisely at the channel's narrowest point, canted at an angle that would have looked accidental to anyone who hadn't been looking for it. She crouched down and looked at the underside of the stone. The soil beneath it was compressed and smoothed in the way that soil becomes when weight has rested on it for a long time. Not months, years. Clara sat back on her heels in the gray light and let herself understand what she was looking at. She heard Ethan's footsteps behind her. He'd come to find her when the animals were settled, and he stood at the edge of the channel and looked at what she was looking at, and for a long time neither of them spoke. 2 years, she said, maybe 3. From the compression. The year my yield started dropping, he said. His voice was very controlled. The year Thornton called in my note early. He created the problem, Clara said. Then waited for it to become desperate enough that you'd have no choice but to sell or take whatever terms he offered. And when I still didn't sell, he engineered your father's debt to become urgent, made sure you couldn't earn enough to cover it, made sure the only option left looked like losing everything. She looked up at him. Except you didn't lose it, because you found another way. Ethan crouched down beside her. He reached out and put his hand on the stone. Then he looked at her, and what was in his face was almost more than she could bear to witness the accumulated weight of 3 years of self-reproach being rewritten all at once, the particular agony of a man who had believed himself to be failing and was now understanding that he had been robbed. I want to move it, he said. Right now, not yet. She put her hand on his arm. Not until after we've dealt with Thornton. If we move it now, he'll know we found it. He'll find another angle. She met his eyes. Let's pay him first. Let's let him think he's walking away with nothing but a debt paid. And then we'll move it. And we'll know that next spring these fields will drink the water they've been denied for 3 years. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he covered her hand with his and nodded. After Thornton, he said, Thornton arrived at noon on the 14th of November. He came on horseback alone, unhurried the gait of a man confident of his reception. He dismounted at their gate with the ease of someone arriving to collect what was owed and walked up to the porch where Clara and Ethan stood waiting. He stopped a few feet short when he saw their faces. Something in their stillness, the absence of dread, the particular quality of two people who had already decided what was going to happen, registered in his eyes as information before he had consciously processed it. Mr. Cole, Mrs. Cole, his smile was in place. I hope you have good news for me. We have your payment, Ethan said. He held out the leather pouch. $300 in bills and coin counted precisely. Thornton's smile didn't disappear, but something behind it recalibrated. He took the pouch, opened it, counted. His hand slowed as he neared the end. He counted again. $300, not a penny more or less. Well, he said. The word came out differently than his others had, less certain, the voice of a man recalculating on the fly. The debt is settled, Ethan said. In full, per the terms of the original note, which specified no additional interest if payment was made by the stated deadline. I have the paperwork, Clara added, if you'd like to review it. Thornton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked at the pouch, then at them, then at the farm, the fields, the barn, the house, with the expression of a man who has watched something he considered already his slip out of his hands. Very well, he said finally. The debt is satisfied. He tucked the pouch into his coat. I'll file the necessary paperwork with the county clerk. See that you do, Clara said. He turned toward his horse. She let him take 2 steps. Mr. Thornton, he paused, looked back at her over his shoulder. The Western Water Channel, she said. We found the blockage. We've documented it, the position, the compression pattern, the timeline. She kept her voice entirely level. We're not making any accusations today. We're simply letting you know that we know, and that we'll be watching to make sure nothing like it happens again. The silence stretched. Thornton looked at her, then at Ethan, then at something past both of them, some calculation. He was running some assessment of what she'd said and what it meant for him if it went further. Then he turned back to his horse, mounted, and rode away down the road without looking back. Clara and Ethan stood on the porch and watched until he was out of sight. Then simultaneously, they both released a breath they'd been holding for weeks. The air smelled like November, cold and clean, and faintly of sage. Above them, the first clouds of what would become the early winter were moving in from the north, gray and purposeful. We did it, Ethan said. Not a question, a fact he was still assimilating. We did it, Clara said. He turned to her then, and she saw everything in his face at once, the exhaustion and the relief and the grief for the years lost and the hope for the years ahead. And something else, something that had been building for weeks and had no more reason to hide. He pulled her into his arms, and she went without hesitation, her face pressed against his chest, her hands fisting in the back of his coat. He held on like she was a fixed point in a world that had spent 3 years trying to take everything from him. I couldn't have done this without you, he said into her hair. Any of it. The harvest, the trip, the fighting, you. He stopped. You saw what I couldn't see. In the fields. With Thornton. In me. A pause. You saw me as more than my failures. You were never failing, she said. You were fighting a rigged game. That's different. You're the first person who's ever said that to me. She pulled back far enough to look up at him. Then the people in your life haven't been paying attention. He looked at her, and she looked at him, this man who had bought her like livestock, and then treated her like someone worth respecting, who had kept every promise he'd made when keeping them, cost him everything, who had said, you're the best thing about this whole disaster, in a boarding house in Cheyenne with tears in his voice and no expectation of anything in return. Ethan, she said, yes, I'm going to stay. She said it clearly, deliberately, not because I have nowhere to go, not because I have to, because I want to, Because this is where I've decided I want to be. She watched his face. Do you understand the difference? I do, he said. His voice was rough. I understand. Good. She tightened her hands in his coat, then stopped looking at me like I might leave. He kissed her, not tentatively, not as a question. With the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of careful distance, finally released everything that had been building through harvest and rain and exhaustion and honesty, in the slow, unlooked-for miracle of two people choosing each other past the point where they had to. She kissed him back with the same completeness. With her hands in his coat and the November wind in her hair, and their farm spread out around them on all sides, pale western fields, and leaning barn and weathered house and all. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. His forehead rested against hers. Come inside, he said. In a minute. She turned in his arms to face the western fields. First, she felt him understand. His arms stayed around her from behind as she led them both off the porch across the yard to the edge of the western water channel. The stone was where she'd left it, gray and heavy and deliberate. Ethan bent down and gripped it with both hands. His knuckles whitened. His back straightened. The stone moved, resisting at first, then giving way all at once, the way things held too long in one place, finally give way. He set it aside. They both looked at the channel, at the narrow point where the blockage had been, at the bark-damp soil where water had not been allowed to go for years. And then slowly the water began to move. She heard it before she saw it, the quiet rush of water finding its path again, spreading into the channel, moving toward the pale fields that had been starved of it for 3 years. It wasn't dramatic. It was just water doing what water does when the thing blocking it is finally removed. But Clara felt tears on her face that she hadn't decided to cry. Ethan's arms tightened around her from behind. They're going to be good fields, he said quietly. Come spring. Yes, she said. They are. Her mother came 3 days later. Margaret Whitmore arrived in a borrowed wagon on a gray afternoon carrying a single bag and the expression of a woman who had spent 60 miles on a road rehearsing what she was going to say and had arrived without certainty that any of it was adequate. Clara met her at the gate. Her mother looked at her, at the calloused hands, the work dress, the face that had lost something and gained something else in its place, and her own face did something complicated. Is there room, she asked. For a while, if you need me. Clara looked at her mother, at this woman who had been sold by her own father to a man who broke her slowly over 20 years, who had said please in a church in September because she had nothing left to offer her daughter except 2 words and a prayer. She thought about Ark, about what it meant that she was standing on her own land having fought for it and won it, while her mother stood at the gate with a plan and a question. She thought about what her mother had said on her first evening. I also came to somewhere like this once far away and strange. Come in, Clara said. Yes, there's room. Margaret stepped through the gate. She looked around at the farm, the fields, the barn, the house. Her eyes stopped on the western fields, where the pale soil had already begun to darken slightly at the edges as the water reached it again. What happened there, she asked. We fixed the water, Clara said simply. Come inside. It's cold. In the kitchen with the stove going and coffee on, they sat at the rough table and something shifted between them. Not reconciliation that would take longer and would never be complete, and both of them knew it, but something more honest than the distance they'd maintained. The acknowledgement that they were 2 women who had been handed the same impossible circumstances and had found different ways to survive them. Margaret looked at her hands on the table. He's gone, she said. Your father. Took what he could carry and left, I don't know where. I expected that, Clara said. I know. Her mother looked up. I should have expected it years ago. I should have, she stopped. Mama? Clara waited until her mother met her eyes. You survived. That's not nothing. Her mother's eyes filled. She looked away quickly, the way a woman looks away who has learned that tears are a luxury she can't afford. You're stronger than me, she said. I had better circumstances, Clara said. A man who kept his promises, she paused. And I had your voice in my head saying please, reminding me that there was someone worth surviving for. Margaret sat very still for a moment. Then she reached across the table and covered Clara's hand with hers. They stayed like that for a while in the warm kitchen while the November wind worked at the gaps in the boards and nothing more needed to be said. The winter arrived hard and fast. Snow in November, 6 inches. By December, temperatures that turned the water in the well to ice overnight and found every gap in the boards with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. They burned through firewood faster than Ethan had planned. They rationed food more than was comfortable. The days were short and cold, and the work never stopped keeping Bessie alive, keeping the chickens producing, keeping the stove fed, keeping the walls of the house between them and the elements that wanted in. In late January, with February still ahead of them and the food stores lower than any of them wanted to count, the Hendersons sent word. They were the nearest neighbors 10 miles, which in this country might as well be adjacent. A couple in their 50s who had homesteaded this valley 15 years ago and built something that worked. Their message was simple. They needed to travel to Cheyenne for a month to visit a daughter who just had a baby. Their farm needed watching. They're offering wages, Ethan said, reading the letter at the kitchen table. Food, too, whatever we need from their stores. Clara looked at him, at her mother who had taken to sitting at the table in the evenings and whose presence had shifted from tentative to quietly necessary over the weeks since she arrived. Then we go, Clara said. The Henderson farm was larger and better maintained, their livestock healthier, their house insulated against the cold with the care of people who had learned from years of Wyoming winters what corners could not be cut. The food stores were abundant. They ate, really ate meat, vegetables, bread with butter, the kind of meals that put weight back on bodies that had been running at a deficit for months. Clara watched Ethan's face change over the first 2 weeks. The permanent furrow between his brows eased. He slept longer and woke without the haunted urgency that had followed him since September. He laughed once genuinely at something her mother said at dinner, a short sound of real amusement that startled all three of them, and then laughed again at his own surprise. Her mother blossomed in small ways. She and Clara worked together in the Henderson kitchen, and Margaret's hands, which had shaken for months, was something that wasn't entirely cold, steadied in the warmth. She taught Clara things she'd known and forgotten: how to make bread that didn't need stretching, how to put up preserves, how to keep a house against winter, with the small, persistent knowledge that women accumulate over decades of making do. One evening they sat together after dinner. Just the two of them. Ethan had gone to check the livestock. The house quiet around them, and her mother looked at the warm kitchen with its good lamp and its solid walls and said simply, "You built something good here." "We built it," Clara said. "Yes." Her mother looked at her. "That's what I said." Clara smiled. It was a small smile, private, directed at the table more than at anyone, but it was real. March came, and with it, the first hesitation of winter, a day. In the second week, when the temperature rose above freezing for the first time in months and the snow at the south-facing eaves began to drip, they returned to their own farm with a wagon loaded with food stores. The Hendersons had insisted they take payment for good work, Mrs. Henderson had said, in a voice that dared them to argue, and $60 in wages that would cover the cost of spring seed with money to spare. The farm looked as they had left it. The western fields were still snow-covered, but at the edges where the sunlight hit longest, there were hints of something Clara had been watching for. A darkness in the soil, moisture, the suggestion that water given the chance would do what water does. 3 weeks later, she and Ethan made the trip to Laramie to see Peter Calloway. The feed and seed operation was exactly what Fletcher's card had promised: solid, honest, the kind of enterprise run by a man who believed that his business was only good and as long as the farmers who supplied him were still farming. Calloway read Fletcher's card, looked them over, asked a few questions about their land and their operation that were direct and practical and entirely without condescension. Then he extended credit for 30 bushels of wheat seed at $3 a bushel, payable in 2 installments after harvest at 5% interest. $90 total, $94.50 with interest. "We'll have it by November," Ethan said. "See that you do." Calloway shook both their hands. "Fletcher says you're good people. I take that seriously. Don't make me regret it." "We won't," Clara said. They planted in April. The western fields, when the snow finally left them, were different. Not dramatically, nothing about good soil work was dramatic, but the color was different, darker at the edges, richer. And when Ethan drove the plow through the first furrow in the field that had been pale and starved for 3 years, he stopped the plow and crouched down and took a handful of the turned earth in his hands. He held it for a moment, just held it. Clara, walking the adjacent row with the seed bag, watched him. watched him open his hands and let the soil fall through his fingers, dark and fine and alive. He looked up at her. "It's good earth," he said. His voice was unsteady. "Yes," she said. "It always was." They planted every acre in the weeks that followed, Ethan driving the plow, Clara walking behind with the seed, her mother watching from the porch in the afternoons, and occasionally bringing water when the work went too long past midday. The Hendersons came by twice and stayed to help, and brought with them two other neighboring families who had heard about the coal farm and what had happened there, and whose presence turned the remaining planting from a two-person exhaustion into something that had the feel of community. Clara hadn't known she was missing community until she stood in a field alongside three other women, all of them working, and someone started singing quietly, not a performance, just the unconscious music of shared effort, and two others picked it up. She thought about her grandfather's shop, about the saddles that lasted 30 years, about making things that held. "We could expand," she told Ethan that evening, sitting on the porch steps in the May dusk. "The leather work? I could take commissions from the farms nearby. People always need harnesses repaired." He looked at her. "You want to?" "I think I do." She looked at her hands. "My grandfather spent his whole life making things that lasted. I'd like to do that too, alongside the farm, not instead of it." "Then do it," Ethan said. "Simple as that." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me it's impractical, or that we need to focus on the farm first, or you fix that harness in an afternoon," he said. "It's still holding. That's not impractical. That's skill." He paused. "Besides, I told you once that I'd like to teach someday. It would seem hypocritical to tell you your ambitions are unrealistic." Clara looked at the planted fields in the evening light, at the pale scar of the water channel now running clear, at the barn that still leaned, but leaned less than it had reinforced through the winter with borrowed tools and borrowed time. "We should keep bees," she said. Ethan blinked. "Bees, for honey and pollination. The wheat would produce better." She glanced at him. "I read about it in one of your father's books. I only have 3 books. I read all 3. She met his eyes, and for a moment the look between them was entirely warm, entirely private, entirely theirs. "There's a lot of good information in them." He shook his head slowly, but he was smiling that rare, genuine smile that changed his whole face and still startled her with its existence. "Bees," he said. "All right, we'll keep bees." The summer that followed was the best growing season the valley had seen in 4 years. Everyone said so: the Hendersons, the Brewsters, from 10 miles east, the newer families who'd homesteaded in the past few seasons and were still learning the land's rhythms. The rains came when they should and stopped when they should, and the sun worked steadily through July and August without the cruelty of drought. The coal farm's wheat grew tall. The western fields, watered properly for the first time in years, produced with a vigor that made Ethan stand at their edges in the evenings and simply look the way a man looks at something he'd been told was impossible. Clara expanded the leather operation gradually, a reputation spreading through the neighboring farms for harness repair that held for saddle work done to a standard that outlasted cheaper alternatives. Her mother helped where she could and found in the work a kind of purpose she hadn't had since before Clara could remember. In August, Clara understood she was pregnant. She told Ethan on a Thursday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, both of them in the comfortable exhaustion of a good day's work. She said it plainly because that was how they said things to each other. His face went through surprise, then awe, then fear, then something that contained all 3. "We're going to have a child," he said, as if he needed to hear himself say it. "Yes, he stopped. "I'm not sure I know how to—" "Neither do I," Clara said. "We'll learn. It's what we do." He reached across the table. She took his hand. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you terribly?" "Good," she said. "That means we understand what it means." He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The lamp burned between them, and outside the summer evening was moving toward dark, and the wheat they'd planted in April was standing tall in fields that had once been starved and now weren't. The harvest came in September, 1 year to the month since the morning Clara had stood at a wash basin, scrubbing a plate that was already clean. This time they had help from the beginning. The Hendersons, the 2 families from the south edge of the valley, a young couple who'd homesteaded in the spring and were still learning which neighbors could be trusted and which couldn't, and had determined through careful observation that the Coles fell into the former category. What had taken Clara and Ethan 6 weeks the year before took 3 weeks with community hands. The work was still hard, harvest was always hard, but there was something different in the doing of it, alongside people who wanted you to succeed, who showed up with their own tools and went home tired and came back the next morning. Clara moving through the rows with a growing belly and hands that knew the work now as well as any hands she'd seen, felt something she hadn't known to want. Belonging, she thought. This is what belonging feels like. The harvest brought in $340. More than any year, Ethan had records for more than his father's best year per the old ledger he kept in the drawer beneath his mother's sampler. They paid Calloway his first installment before the month was out. Watched him record it in his ledger with a nod of satisfaction. On track, he said. Come see me in November for the rest. We'll be here, Clara said. Why? The baby came in December during the first real snowstorm of winter. Mrs. Henderson came trudging through knee-deep snow with the determination of a woman who had delivered half the babies in the valley and was not about to miss this one. 2 other neighbor women came as well. Ethan was sent to the barn, which he accepted with the gratitude of a man who knew his limitations. Clara labored through 8 hours and came out the other side with a daughter, small, red-faced, entirely convinced of the outrage of her circumstances and utterly impossibly perfect. Ethan came in when it was done. He crossed the room without speaking and sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent a long time not believing in good things and has just been required by evidence he cannot dispute to revise that position. He touched his daughter's hand with one finger. She gripped it with a reflexive firmness that startled him into something between a laugh and a sound he couldn't name. What should we call her? Clara asked. He looked up. His face was wet. He didn't seem to have noticed. Hope, he said, because that's what she is. That's what both of you are. Clara looked at her daughter, at the name settling over her, finding its fit. Hope Cole, she said. She looked at Ethan. He was looking back at her with everything in his face at once, the man who had sat in a good chair holding his hat like a prayer, the man who had cried alone in a barn over his father's letter, the man who had handed her up into a wagon with careful hands and promised her safety when safety was all he had. I love you, she said, not for the first time, but with a completeness that hadn't been there before. I love you, he said. I have for a long time. I just didn't know how to say it until you showed me that saying true things was safe. Outside, the snow came down thick and silent over the fields, over the western fields, that had drunk their fill of water all summer and given it back as grain over the barn, that leaned but held over the road that led away toward Cheyenne and Laramie, and the world they'd had to travel through to find their way back to each other. Clara held her daughter and felt for the first time in her life entirely unafraid of what came next. 10 years later, the farm was 80 acres by then. The leaning barn had been replaced, rebuilt with community labor over 3 August days, the new structure standing straight against the Wyoming sky. The house had been extended another bedroom, a proper parlor, a workroom where Clara kept her leather tools, and the growing inventory of commissions that came from farms and ranches across a 50-mile radius. 3 children now, Hope dark-haired and precise, and already showing signs of her father's careful honesty. Samuel 6, who had inherited Clara's grandfather's wins and spent hours at the workbench watching her work with the intensity of someone who intended to learn. And Grace 3, who had inherited apparently no one's disposition for caution and kept both her parents in a state of productive anxiety. Margaret Whitmore was still with them. She had become, over a decade, the kind of grandmother who is so thoroughly woven into the fabric of a household that the household cannot quite imagine itself without her. She had not spoken of Clara's father in years. There was nothing to say. Thornton had been brought before a territorial investigation 3 years after that November morning, a broader inquiry into his lending practices, which had apparently been ruining farms across 4 counties with variations on the same scheme. He had lost his business and his standing and eventually the county. Clara heard this from Fletcher, who reported it with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for justice to catch up with a particular injustice for a long time. Didn't need to do anything with your documentation in the end, he told her, but it was good to know it existed. On the day of their 10th anniversary, Clara and Ethan walked the farm's perimeter at dusk, a habit they'd developed in the second year of the ritual survey of the thing they'd built together. The western fields were deep green in September, the wheat heading out heavy in gold. The water channel ran clear and full along the fence line. The new barn caught the last light and threw it back. Ethan stopped at the edge of the western fields and looked out across them. Clara stopped beside him close enough that their shoulders touched. "My father wrote that the land holds everyone we ever were," he said. "I used to read that and feel like a failure, like I wasn't adding anything worth holding." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about it differently now. How I think we added something." He looked at the field. "I think whatever this land holds now includes a woman who fixed a harness and found a blocked water channel and refused to quit when quitting would have been so much easier." He looked at her. "And I think it includes a man who eventually stopped being too proud to admit he needed someone." Clara looked at the field, at the water moving in the channel, at the children's voices coming from the direction of the house, Hope's precise, Samuel's enthusiastic graces unintelligible and insistent. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Not because she doubted, because she wanted to hear him say it. Not for a single moment. He said it without hesitation, without the careful weighing she'd watched him do with difficult questions in the early days. It came out the way true things come out when you've lived with them long enough that they don't need examination anymore. "I married a woman I didn't know, and she turned out to be the most remarkable person I've ever encountered. The fact that we started the way we did." He shook his head. "I think that's just the way hard things begin. Badly. And then you find out what's actually in them." Clara reached out and took his hand. He closed his around hers. "My grandfather used to say that the best leather work comes from the hardest leather," she said. "That the hides that have been through the most are the ones that hold the longest once you work them right." He sounds like a man worth knowing. He was. She squeezed his hand. "He would have liked you." They stood at the edge of the western fields in the September dusk, hand in hand, while the water ran clear in the channel below them, and the crops stood in the last light, and their children's voices drifted toward them on the autumn air. The poorest man in Mercer County had bought a bride he couldn't afford, with money he didn't have, and she had stayed not because she had to, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had looked at this man, at his kept promises, his honest grief, his stubborn refusal to stop fighting, even when fighting seemed useless, and chosen him, not the transaction, not the desperation, him. And from that choice, made in the ruins of a forced beginning, they had built something the land would hold, for as long as there was land to hold it. They walked back toward the house together, toward the warm light in the windows, and the voices inside, and the life they had earned one difficult day at a time. And the water ran on the channel behind them, doing what water does when the thing blocking it is finally removed, finding its way, moving forward, giving life to everything it touched. If Clara and Ethan's story moved you, if you believe that the hardest beginnings can lead to the most beautiful lives, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you know someone who needs to hear that broken things can be rebuilt, share this with them today.